We're back here on the platform today, and we are talking about Dr. Robert Love, who was a great medical missionary, and he was a legislator and an advocate of Pan-African unity. Our guest is Mr. Phillip Smith today. And Mr. Smith, I sometimes wonder why we would celebrate a man like Robert Love, who really did not make the contribution to Bahamian society, because many would say that he abandoned the Bahamas for other countries, and I just wondered the extent to which he came back from time to time from Haiti or from Jamaica to talk about the Bahamas and Bahamians, because Garvey spent some time in the Bahamas, a considerable amount of time, I'm told.
Now, if I could put this in perspective.
Yes.
Garvey spent his time in the Bahamas visiting and helping to establish branches of the UNIA and spoke in Grantstown.
Yes.
But that was after Garvey had been deported from the United States and thrown out of the United States. And he was in Jamaica and in the United Kingdom. And part of the process of traveling permitted him to come and visit. And there was a desire and a movement in the 20s and 30s among black people to sensitize black people that they were not required to see themselves as less than white people, but that if they would only open their eyes and appreciate their reality, they would recognize that they were equal to anyone.
But there was a deep appreciation in the Bahamas for the work, the teachings of Marcus Garvey, who came out of Jamaica.
Went to the United States.
Yes.
Like I say, put it in perspective.
Yes.
Robert Love became physically ill about 10 years before his death, which would have been that he became physically ill around 1905.
Okay.
Now, before that, from 91 when he went to Jamaica, or 81 when he went to Haiti, in that period of time, black people in the Bahamas, black people, and not the few coloreds who were permitted to have a role in order to have that buffer between the white and black populations. But black people, and Robert Love would have been that, were not encouraged to be active in anything. And a Robert Love, I don't know that he made an attempt to come back, but if he did, would have been seriously discouraged, particularly with what he was preaching in Jamaica, because that was revolutionary talk. And the colonial authority here would have been advised by the colonial authority in Jamaica that this fellow is a troublemaker, but he got to follow him.
Yeah, but Marcus Garvey had revolutionary talk as well.
Well, like I said, Marcus Garvey, you will recall I mentioned, was mentored by way of Love's writings and whatnot by Robert Love.
Right.
And Marcus Garvey had a great impact throughout the world, and particularly in the United States, where his following went into the millions in the 19-teens and 1920s. And where the American government was so afraid of his not just teaching, but the following he had, that some say, and I believe this to be the case, that he was set up to be found guilty of what is now generally accepted not to have been a criminal act at all, so that he could be sent to prison, and then that would be used as the means to deport him as a former prisoner. I don't want to suggest for 1 minute that Garvey, a great man, did us a great honor by coming to visit and by speaking at Southern Recreation Ground, that he did us that honor. I don't know why specifically Robert Love didn't come back, but I presume it's because the colonial authorities in Jamaica would have said to the colonial authorities here, you don't want him. They would have used some derogatory term to describe him, I'm sure. But what I suggest, what the committee says with reference to Robert Love is simply this. He, for the first quarter century of his 3/4 of a century long life, lived to be 75 years old. He spent in New Providence. He spent in Grantstown. His early nurturing was among Bahamians. His early drive, and you, having been not too long ago a young person yourself, and who have children, recognize that that first quarter century is what determines the kind of person you are for the rest of your life. So the great that he became was created within our bosom.
According to the writings that I saw, he grew up in a closely knit community in Grantstown, went to St. Agnes, was an active member of St. Agnes well into his 20s, but did not come back to serve as a priest at all after he was ordained in the United States, right?
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Like I say, you know, there's some who suggest that that he was disinvited to pursue his interest in becoming a priest in the Bahamas. There's some who suggested that he was invited to explore other opportunities elsewhere. Whatever that reality is, he left. And excelled in his life for the following 50 years and contributed greatly to Haiti and contributed greatly to Jamaica. And as we accepted the immigrant, Mr. Dillette, into our society, and there's a school named in his honor, and hopefully over time more and more people will focus on who he was and what his contributions were, just as we need to focus on C.R. Walker, not just to pass by the building that still stands that he built, but to understand why it is that he wanted to do that. The fact that he became a medical doctor, again, during a time when black people in the United States were not encouraged to think that was something they should achieve, and to have done so was to overcome many obstacles which C.R. Walker overcame, which Dr. Eneas overcame, which Dr. Burnside overcame, which so many did. And that it is all of their lives. For instance, we like to talk about the emancipation of the slaves. We like to talk about
but Love was a slave, legally a slave, wasn't he?
No, he was born in 1839. After.
Yeah, but when you talk about
well, he would have been a colonial subject.
Yes,
he would have been treated as all colonial subjects of color would have been treated in that time. But he was born 6 years after the proclamation in the UK Parliament. So he would not himself have been born into the institution.
Into slavery, yes, okay.
But I was saying that before that British law, there were a couple of things happened which we tend to push aside. The biggest of them was the revolution in Haiti, which started 1791, just 25 years after the American Revolution for independence started. And when we talk about the American Revolution, we give it great credit, great value. They were a wonderful people who defeated the colonial overlords, the British, and established this great republic. But they were themselves Europeans who fought each other. In Haiti, the enslaved population rose up and defeated the might of Europe, defeated France in a war, defeated the British, who decided that since their slave traders were selling plenty slaves to Haiti, and that was the only place that was buying fresh slaves, they had to help the French recover ownership and control of Haiti so that they could continue to sell product. And the revolutionaries in Haiti, who had been enslaved people just a few years before, defeated them. The Spanish got into this act too. They defeated the Spanish. The French, having recovered from the loss and said, you know, Haiti is too valuable to not have, they came back and tried to recover it again. These people defeated them until finally in 1804, they declared the existence of the Republic of Haiti. And then, 3 years after that, the British passed a law to outlaw the slave trade. I suggest they did so because their shop for selling slaves had closed up because the only place buying slaves was Haiti, and they had been out of the slave buying business by then for 16 years. So they said, oh, okay, we shut this down. Then after that, the plantations weren't making all sorts of money, so they said, you know, hey, wait a minute, we're losing money there, we need money here, let's do this thing. And finally, the abolitionists, who included people like Mr. Pompey in Exuma, who fought for his legal rights, not for his freedom as a human being, but for his legal rights as an enslaved person. And other revolutionaries in the Bahamas, Mr. Dick and others, Miss Mary in Cat Island, in San Salvador, in Eleuthera, who fought for their right to be able to exist as human beings.
Then you got to remember the story of Paul, Kate, and Crocodile.
Precisely. There were any number of people in our jurisdiction who, though legally the chattel property of somebody else, fought for their right to be recognized as human beings. All of this supported the effort of English abolitionists, who Dr. Love went to great pains to recognize, for preachers in the UK who fought for many years for the abolition. But the bottom line is, I don't see the English Act of 1807 to abolish the slave trade and the English Act of 1833 to emancipate slaves as some kindness. I saw it as simple reaction to commercial interests at the time. They did not have regard for Africans who were enslaved in the Caribbean as human beings.
Mrs. Smith, you know, you do a fantastic job in explaining this, but you know, you people like yourself should get a poor grade for not being able to bring this forward and not to have Bahamian students over the years understand their history, understand people like Robert Love and Marcus Garvey and all the rest of it. I told you during the break that I remember you as chairman of the commission to celebrate the quincentennial of the landfall of Christopher Columbus. You did a whole lot of work with respect to Columbus and the 500th anniversary of his landfall in the Bahamas. But you didn't do too much work on slavery and Marcus Garvey, Robert Love, and all Pompey and all these other people that you spoke of. Haven't we failed a whole generation of Bahamians, Mr. Smith?
Well, I agree with you that we've failed, not just this generation, generations previous, but I don't plead guilty to what you just suggested you might consider me guilty of. The reality is that if you were to ask this community, and I believe the whole CARICOM community in their individual states, whether governments and individuals like myself should spend time and energy in this discussion of that period past and its impact on this period now, the majority, and in some cases, in some states, the vast majority of black people who are descendants of an enslaved people would say, no, 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 let's belong to the past, leave it in the past. They would quote Mr. David Cameron, Prime Minister of Jamaica, of Britain. He might be able to win an election in Jamaica, I don't know. But since his family had properties in Jamaica, I suppose he has a connection. But in Jamaica recently, he said, let the past stay in the past. Let's focus on how we could move forward. And that's the difficulty we have, because most people don't want to acknowledge that it is the past that served as the means for the present to exist, and it is that and now which will determine where we will be in time to come. With regard to an effort to encourage students, recently I had the great pleasure of talking at a few high schools, C.H. Reed's, Phoebe Bethel and whatnot. I was impressed with the content of the questions that came from the students, junior and senior level. I was particularly impressed with the passion with which they reacted to my description of the horror of slavery. Because over the years, we've been led to believe that slavery was Uncle Tom's Cabin. There was this backward person who really had nothing, who was permitted to live somewhere and provided food by a kind woman. And that was slavery. Kindness being provided to a backward people. But it wasn't that. It was human beings treated less than a horse would have been treated, who were treated as chattel, who could be beaten, who could be abused, who could be killed with no penalty because it's my property. And it is, when you look at, recently, last week, there was a wonderful letter in the newspaper written by Dr. Indira Martin having to do with epigenetics and the effect of what our ancestors would have eaten, where our ancestors would have lived, what kind of quality of water they would have had. That continues to impact us. Now, people say, well, we could overcome any bad habits we have. Well, she also pointed out that in recent history, the last 70 years, that the children and grandchildren of people who were abused by the Nazis in Germany and Poland in the concentration camps continue into, so far, the second and into the third generation to suffer the effects of the ill treatment from their time in concentration camps during the Holocaust. Well, slavery, the Maafa, was a Holocaust, an attempt to dehumanize, to degrade, to abuse a nation of people, simply because they were black Africans. And the effect of that dehumanizing effort, that abortion of a time, continues to negatively affect us. Yes. And the great problem we have is that whereas European governments now say that was bad, and some of them even go so far as to say it's a regrettable part of our history.
And they've apologized, some of them.
No, none have yet apologized for their government's participation. Individuals have. Because they say, well, to apologize is to accept responsibility, and then that carries with it some other things. Well, the reality is that how could we begin to heal? For instance, if I were to step on your foot by accident and hurt your toe, to begin the process of restoring us to where we would have been before your pain, I need to let you know that I am sorry.
Yeah, but I know that you're a member of the National Reparations Committee, and I've spoken to the gentleman from the Jamaican Parliament who visited the Bahamas recently, who is chairing the effort in Jamaica.
The parliamentary effort.
The parliamentary effort, yes. Many people believe that you're wasting time.
Probably. But you know, people said that about Jesus Christ too, and they said that about his apostles, and they said that about generations and centuries of Christians. Yet you and I, who are Christian, continue the fight.
Yeah, but that is the analogy. I don't know if it's relevant to reparations for slavery, Mr. Smith. You don't expect for Britain and other European countries to pay for whatever they contributed to slavery, do you?
So the suggestion that predecessor governments to the governments, the governments of those countries that were involved in slavery, that had them as legal acts in our territory, that not only abused these people, but used their labor to enrich themselves. To remember, if you look at the economies of Europe, the slave states, France, Spain, Portugal, United Kingdom, you look at Holland, you look at Sweden, you look at them before this nefarious slave trade, and you realize that they were agrarian societies with very small wealth. Within a century, there was this massive change. Within 3 centuries, they had converted themselves from agrarian societies with low incomes to powerhouses that continue to this day. Now, I suggest that the wealth that they took from the Americas, that they took, not were given, they took, the abuse they levied on people was and is a crime.
Okay.
There was a conference in Durban that talked about this issue and suggested that that was a crime against humanity. Now, we hear about the European courts trying military dictatorships from particularly Africa in their courts for crimes against humanity because, and legitimately so, I think, they abused their population, etc. They stole from them, they killed people, and they're on trial.
Yeah, but you don't expect a European court to make a judgment that Europe
why not?
had this nefarious trade.
Why is it illogical for a successor government to accept that a predecessor government did wrong, and that this successor government, which continues to use the benefit of that predecessor government, which stole, which created wealth from thievery and murder, that successor government can't at least say, I'm sorry.
You're not going to live long enough to see that. I'm going to take a break here. And when we return, we want to talk about what is happening in St. Agnes on Sunday the 22nd to mark the anniversary of Robert Love. We'll come right back.